The ancient Indian burial ground is a common trope in horror movies where angry First Nations spirits arise from their disturbed graves to attack the typically white victims. Alicia Elliott, a writer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, looks at this trope and asks, what do the descendants of these spirits fear? While already facing forced assimilation and genocide at the hands of the government, with residential schools, the 60s scoop, police brutality, and a lack of support for anyone wronged in any of those cases, what more is there for Indigenous people of Canada to fear? My name is Alicia Fair, and I am from the unceded territory of the Tecumlip's Tishaquetnik, and I am Canadian. The ancient Indian burial ground was never a far-off concept for me. In 2020, 215 bodies of First Nations children were found on the grounds of the residential school in my hometown. The residential school in my hometown was this big brick building, scarier than any vampires or ghosts. It was still committing crimes against First Nations people all the way into the 80s. Now, unless the story is about the impact of residential schools on First Nations people, the Indian burial ground trope is inappropriate and outdated. Beyond residential schools, many tribes have unique, scary stories about what may lurk in the Great Canadian Wilderness. For example, the Inuit believe in a half-woman, half-monster called Kulapalik that lurks beneath the ocean ice with a baby carrier strapped around her back to take any careless children who play too close to the open water. I often wonder why the horror industry hasn't capitalized on the untapped potential of the countless First Nations monsters and spooky stories. Unfortunately, we don't have to look very far for an answer. It is because of the residential schools and the wedge it has driven between First Nations people and their culture. Too many stories have been forgotten and dismissed, and in an industry like film, where money makes most of the decisions, it's hard for First Nations stories to climb up the ladder. However, spaces for First Nations people and other misrepresented groups have recently been making significant positive changes in the industry, and we are seeing a lot new perspectives. Jeff Barnaby, a would-be up-and-coming horror director, was paving the way for First Nations stories. In 2013, he released a movie, Rhymes for Young Ghouls. It follows the story of a young girl growing up on the Red Crow Indian Reserve in the 60s and the 70s. The movie is not based on fiction, and Ayla's story is a reflection of real stories told by First Nations people. It highlights the crimes residential schools committed on families, physically, sexually, and mentally. Ayla is guided through the movie by the ghost zombie form of her mother, and it is very touching while still being quite spooky. Jeff Barnaby also used animation and art in conjunction with his live action shots to bring First Nations storytelling values into his work. However, Rhymes for Young Ghouls is not a very well known movie. When searching for Indigenous horror movies, you are more likely to find 70s movies with Indian burial ground tropes. Jeff Barnaby amended that in 2018 when he released the movie Blood Quantum, another movie set on the Red Crow Indian Reserve. This movie follows the story of the reserve's efforts against a zombie outbreak in the 80s. It gained much more popularity than Barnaby's other movies. I figured this was because it seemed like the message in the movie was a watered down version to make it more palatable to the paying audiences. My close friend and avid horror lover artist Kayla Vandehoof explained to me, however, that even though this movie was a straightforward retelling of what was seen before in zombie films, it is essential because not only does it open a gateway to allow more First Nations stories to be told, it also, in her words, shows First Nations kids that they can fuck up zombies just as well as anybody else can. Before I conclude, I would like to talk about the new Martin Scorsese movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. Though this movie isn't considered horror, I would like to acknowledge that because Scorsese is such a big name and he went about telling the story of the Osage people in a very respectable fashion, we could potentially see a boom in great First Nations stories. Storytelling is a fundamental part of Indigenous culture, and it is also a fundamental part of film. And therefore, once we start looking at storytelling from different perspectives than the classical Western Hollywood films, we could see great innovation in art and culture. I hope in the coming years we get to see many more exciting horror films.